So I want to introduce our two speakers, and I'm really excited to have both Dan Forsythe and Jill Vernes joining us today. Dan and Jill are veteran TUR planners. They work with Capaccio. They just have a wealth of experience in working with a number of different companies and a number of different industry sectors around both toxics use reduction planning and reporting, as well as I'm sure a million other things. And so they're going to be sharing with us their insights into kind of best practices around materials accounting. So I'm going to let you guys sort of do a deeper introduction for yourself if you'd like before we get going, but I want to go ahead and hand it over to both of you. And thank you so much for being here.
Great, thanks. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So I guess I'm Dan Forsythe. I've been with Capaccio Environmental Engineering since 2004. I'm a CHMM, I'm a TUR planner, I'm a certified auditor. I don't know, that's about it.
And I'm Jill Vernes. I've been with Capaccio for about 10 years, and I have worked at other companies before that. I've been working in the environmental industry for about 25 years. Started off at hazardous waste cleanup sites, and now I do TUR planning on the more proactive end of things. And looking forward to hearing some ideas, not just from ourselves, but also from everybody else out there.
Yep, I agree.
All right, so let's dive in. I want to thank Pam Eliason and everyone at TUR for helping us put this together and for inviting us to speak today. We are going to be talking about materials accounting, which is in the TUR planning process as part of characterizing your processes. This is not intended to be some kind of primer or math exercise for calculating material usage, but rather sharing and discussing some tips and tricks that we've learned throughout doing these over the past several years. Next slide, please, Dan. These are the big topics that we're hoping to cover today. Data quality and validation. There's a lot of simple checks you can do to ensure that your data is both accurate, correct, and also representative of what's actually happening at your facility. It's essential to maintain consistency between what you report on your Form S and the numbers that you use in your TUR planning process. But it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel. Lots of the material that you produce for the reporting can be used in the planning and vice versa. Make sure that you're using a good unit of product that will show TUR improvements. And there's lots of different options for that. So we'll have a discussion about that when we get there. And then integral recycling, which can be a tricky thing to wrap your head around, but make sure that your integral recycling meets the TUR definition so that you can take credit for it when you get to the planning process. Next slide. So we'll jump into data quality. And again, these are tips and tricks for getting better data sets. Dan, you can move on. Better data sets, closer alignment between the materials accounting used for reporting and the TUR planning process. And again, I really want to ask when we get to breakout rooms or polls to don't hesitate to share any ideas or best practices, or even pop those in the chat where they can be accumulated later. So just real quick, we'll run through some simple ideas that you can run through to help make sure that you have a better data set. Data clarity. In our case, we get a lot of our data from clients, so they are working at facilities where we do not work. And it's important for us to not guess at what the data means. If we get a data set and we're not sure what the numbers mean, it's a simple phone call can be all it takes to clarify. And I think even for TUR planners who work within a facility, you're often getting data from people who work in different departments or with different data management systems than you are familiar with. And again, just, don't hesitate to ask those questions. Is the data that you're working with seem reasonable? And a really simple check is just to compare it to last year and the year before. Does this data set make sense? The material usage down? Does that make sense with the processes that happened? Again, it's just a simple check. Data consistency. So by this we mean using a lot of the same SDS data so that you're breaking down your constituent usage the same way every time. At Capaccio, we often set up databases of SDS data, and that can take different forms for different clients that we work with. Sometimes that's just an Excel sheet that has the list of materials that they usually use and the constituent breakdown. Sometimes it's an Access database, or sometimes we're using an online source for SDS data. But that way, only the usage amounts are changing each year, and that base constituent data does not shift from year to year. It's also good to have somebody else review your data once you've sort of worked on it a little bit. I find it very helpful to have fresh eyes review the data and the calculations, because if it makes sense to somebody else, then it's probably hanging together. And if somebody else who hasn't been spending the last few weeks inside my spreadsheets has questions about it, then they're probably valid questions that I need to clarify or dig into a little bit. And also, make sure that your data is representative. It's important to use real production values as much as possible and to limit your use of approximations. And again, that probably means going back to my first point, which is getting data from the production people, which may involve the planner working with production to understand what those numbers mean. And if you have to use approximations, then you want to make sure that you're documenting all your assumptions, all your sources, and all your references. This process of data quality is a feedback loop between the detailed process flow diagram that describes your material inputs and outputs, and calculating a mass balance between the inputs and the outputs, and using those two tools together to make sure that you are accounting for all the processes that you understand are happening in the production, and also to make sure that your values are making sense. The forms don't know if your data is accurate. And so we at Capaccio use a feedback between the process flow diagram and the mass balance first before we enter the forms. The forms will tell you if you're balancing, but if you have already gone through that process first, then it makes filling out the forms a whole lot easier. So here's our first polling question. Pam?
Okay, thank you. So I have just launched a poll, and the question is, how often do you update your process flow diagrams? So I'll give you, a minute to just fill that in. Do you do it every year? Do you do it every planning cycle? Do you do it every 5 years or so? Do you only do it when prompted by a production change or by an engineer's comments? Do you never do it, or do you not know how often it's done? All right, we've got about 85% of you responding. Let's give it a few more seconds to go ahead and put in your response. It's important that you do participate in these polls, as I mentioned. So I look forward to seeing your results. Give it a couple more seconds here. All right, I think we've hit it. So I'll end the polling and let me share the results. So that's interesting, right? It looks like about 60% of you reevaluate your process flow diagram and update it every planning cycle. Maybe 20% do it every year, and 15%, 14% only when prompted by a production change. So great, thank you.
All right, so now we'll address how essential it is to maintain consistency between reporting and TUR planning, but also stressing that it's not necessary to, it's helpful to use the tools you already have in place. You don't need to be reinventing the wheel all the time. One very simple process, and again, on the Form S, it will check that your numbers are balancing. But we run this mass balance calculation with our numbers before we get to the forms to make sure that we are accounting for all of the inputs and balancing that with all of the outputs. It's a good test of our data integrity. In this example, we have both nitrate compounds and silver compounds. And over here on the far right, you can see that our calculations have a mass balance of 0, which is what we want to see. And then in this example, we've created an error on purpose. So for hydrochloric acid, our mass balance is off. And in that case, it indicates that we have missed something here with our numbers, where in this table, we have not accounted for some of the hydrochloric acid that was introduced into the process. Dan, can you go back to the next? Yeah. So I just wanted to real quick look at the difference between byproduct and emissions. Oftentimes they are the same. So in the case of nitrate compounds and silver compounds, the emissions are also the byproduct. But in the hydrochloric acid, you can see that quite a bit of that is byproduct, but none of it is actually being emitted. All right, so next slide. So what's the difference between byproduct and emission? Just real quick. Byproduct is anything that's not going into your final product. So that's going to be a lot of the chemicals that we account for as planners. It's the emissions, but also any material that's being used to treat or pre-process materials in the production, but not going out with the product. And that's different from emissions, which are releases of toxic or hazardous substances to the environment. So again, byproduct is emissions and also other non-product outputs. All right, next. And so here we have a breakdown in my example of mass balance considerations. So we'll jump to the bottom of this table on the left real quick. So hydrochloric acid, all of that 26,758 pounds is being otherwise used in the process. So that's some sort of treatment of materials in the production, or maybe wastewater treatment, but not material that's going out with the product. And compare that to nitrate compounds or silver compounds. So in this case, this is a silver plating process. So we've got some silver nitrate that's being processed in the chemical processes to create that silver plate. And then in the chemical reactions, we're coincidentally manufacturing some different compounds that need to be accounted for in the TUR process. So those are all of our inputs on the left there. And then we need to make sure that we're accounting for where all of that material ends up. So whether that's being shipped on the product in the case of the silver, or whether it's being sent to wastewater treatment in the case of hydrochloric acid and the nitrates. And then there's also, in both the silver compounds and the nitrate compounds, a consideration that part of what we are having to account for with the mass balance is that some of that is a compound. And for the outputs on the form, for emissions, we only have to account for the silver portion of that and the nitrate ion. But when we come to the mass balance, we have to account for the other parts of those compounds. Next slide. And then here's our process flow diagram that goes with our silver coating process. So again, you can see over here on the left, materials coming in, and we've got the hydrochloric acid that's otherwise used. We've got some silver compounds coming in. Up at the top, you can see that we are coincidentally manufacturing and also consuming some silver compounds. Then we've got silver going out in the product. We've got a little bit of silver ending up in waste. And also the hydrochloric then moves through the process and onto the wastewater treatment. We've got a little bit of hydrochloric acid also being otherwise used to titrate for neutralization within the wastewater treatment system. And then a little bit of those materials end up going to the POTW. So this is the detailed process flow diagram that, as a consultant, I worked very closely with my plant manager here to develop this so that together we understood where all of these materials were moving through the production. Next slide. So here's our exercise one. And again, this is not intended to be some sort of tricky math problem, but more of a conceptual data quality consideration. So we've got a mass balance for hydrochloric acid, and over on the right, you can see that that's not balancing for some reason. And then we've got our detailed process flow diagram that should give us some clues to why our mass balance is not working out. And we want to look at these things together and look for patterns of alignment. And again, this process flow diagram is something that is required by the planning process. So you may have to change the numbers each year, but you should have this detailed process flow diagram already developed, which will help you analyze your data in conjunction with the mass balance. Pam, do you want to say something else about the?
No, I think thanks, Jill. No, I'll go ahead and I'm going to launch a poll. So we're asking you to just take a look at both the mass balance and the process flow diagram and let us know what you see with respect to why the mass balance does not equal 0 for hydrochloric acid. We've got about 60% of you responding so far. I'd like to give it a couple more seconds, give everybody a chance to put in, to take a look at both the mass balance and the process flow diagram and let us know what your thoughts are on why the mass balance for hydrochloric acid does not equal 0. Okay, it looks like we've got everybody responding who's going to respond. Nope. Couple more people getting them in there. Okay, a couple more seconds. Just go ahead and give us your answer. It's good though to really take a good look at both of these tools whenever you're doing your planning and really doing your mass balance and materials accounting. All right, I'm going to end the polling now and let's see what the results are. So Jill, what do you think about what you see there?
Well, so the 82% who said that HCl was neutralized in wastewater system are correct. So that's what's going on here. And you can then match this 26,079 pounds in the mass balance where it's off to the 26,079 pounds that's neutralized in the wastewater treatment. But I also would like to request again that if there are other conceptual tools that planners use to check for mass balance and to check for alignment and consistency between the numbers you generate for reporting and the numbers that you use in your planning, to please share those. Either go ahead and speak up. I guess you can raise your hand electronically with Pam or to put those in the chat because these are tools that we use. We use them for a lot of our clients, but it's certainly, we don't have a monopoly on good ideas. So I'm always looking for good ideas as well.
Thanks, Jill. And another thing I just want to point out is, so we had a couple people who thought that perhaps the hydrochloric acid was being shipped in product, and that's possible. How would you, so the question is, was there a trace amount of hydrochloric acid that was being shipped out in the product, and how would you determine that? And a couple people responded that hydrochloric acid was emitted to the POTW. And so, I mean, I can see how that might have been the concern? You know that it was generated as a byproduct.
Right.
And as we say, byproducts can be emissions, but they can also be non-product outcomes from the process that don't actually get emitted. And so in this case, the hydrochloric acid is a byproduct from the silver coating line, but it is
Process.
neutralized in the wastewater treatment facility on site. So that wastewater treatment facility is one of the company's production units. So Terry McCormick has a comment here that it says that 26,000 plus was neutralized and 678 pounds were used to treat, but the answer said that 678 was also neutralized. Oh.
Sorry, Terry.
Oh, he did it again.
That's a fair question. So yes, the 678 pounds of HCl that's used to treat is also neutralized. It's broken out differently. And so the way that I would, in this case, what I would do to fix my mass balance, I would add a column here, right, either before or after used to treat, and add in the 2679 specified as neutralized in wastewater treatment. And the reason that the 678 and the 2679 would be broken out would be for clarification on the Form S, so that we could specify those. It would be easier for me to make that distinction here in this spreadsheet before I get to the forms, but you wouldn't necessarily have to. And then you would specify these two values in different spots on the Form S. But that's a good question, because essentially it's all neutralized. And so he's right.
Right. So we have another comment here or question, which is, and it may not apply to this specific example, but do you include chemical held in inventory as part of your byproduct calculation?
No. So chemical held in inventory is not being processed. So only the material that gets put into your process gets accounted for in the mass balance and also in the reporting.
So that's what's being used. And if you
That's
have
what's
a
being
couple of
used,
drums
right.
of hydrochloric acid in your warehouse ready to be used, but they don't get used, then, that's a whole nother issue.
Right. And so it's important then to understand that storage is not usage and usage is not storage. I always use the example of gallons of milk. I have 4 kids and 2 teenage boys, and we use hundreds of gallons of milk every year, but at any one time we're only storing 2 to 3 gallons. So, there can be a significant difference between usage and storage. So you can't really use them as proxies for each other.
So we have a comment here from Jim Kane, again with the names. What about the material held for recycling?
So we're going to cover that later on. So that it depends whether it's integral, whether it's non-integral and recycled on site, or whether it's sent off site to be recycled. So I have down below on the slide set towards the end, I have examples of all 3 of those. And in some instances, it would be a byproduct. In some, it's just a pass through. And in some, you would have to count it as also being used.
Good. So we'll cover that in a minute.
Yep.
And so just to respond to, I can set the chat so that nobody else sees your comments, but I think the chat is a useful way to see each other's comments. And I think, Terry, you were probably being, Terry. Let's see. So Jim Curran, you have a question here. One of the big tricks is dealing with inventory, especially with clients who do not have sophisticated inventory control systems. Comments on that, Jill or Dan?
No, yeah, we run, especially when we get to tier 2 season, we run into that all the time, because people do track what comes out of inventory and what's used. But as far as keeping track of actual inventory, we run into that all the time. Some companies do have, some max mins in their purchasing and accounting, so we can kind of get an idea of, what the max and min might be, but some companies don't. So it is a challenge for us to work with companies a lot of the times to get an actual really good inventory. And you can't just walk around at a snapshot in time, because that might not be the max, it might be the min. So yeah, it's a challenge to do the inventory. Well, yep.
And the same goes for limited practice planners, really, it's a challenge that anybody would face, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And a lot of times, under non-pandemic conditions, we can get a better handle on, especially what's being stored at any one time, by doing a walkthrough
Yep.
of a facility, and really meet with someone who's really knowledgeable about the facility, like whether that's the plant manager or a process engineer, who can give us a really clear idea of how much are they keeping in their stock room or their storage place versus how much is sitting in a bath, because that would have to be taken
Correct.
into account too, both for storage
Correct.
and for your production.
Right.
And so again, that goes back to, checking the representation of your data. You want your data to really represent what's happening in the production, and also storage, which are two different things. And again, having, even a 20 or 30-minute phone call with somebody right now under pandemic conditions can go a pretty long distance towards helping clarify some of those distinctions.
Yep, exactly.
So we have an interesting comment here. We have a third party on site that holds our inventory until we purchase it. So how does that work?
If it's from a tier 2 standpoint, if it's on the contiguous property and you own the property, even if they're just managing it for you, I would think you'd need to count that towards the total. And we could get clarification from EPA on that one, but I've never run it. I have several clients that actually have a local place to actually house a lot of the material, because they don't have enough storage, but it's off-site, it's not on-site. So
yeah, that's an important distinction, Dan, whether it's stored on site or not.
Correct.
Yeah, if it's stored on site, then it should go on your tier 2 for storage, but it definitely wouldn't count as usage until, in this case, it sounds like until you've done the purchasing part, in which case it enters your production line.
Cool. Good questions. Good
Yeah,
comments.
great questions.
Great. Yeah, there's a comment there. Unless the third party is reporting a separate tier 2.
Yes, that's true. And that can be the case sometimes. Depends on how much they're storing and whether they are filing their own tier 2. I mean, tier 2, who files something on a tier 2 can come up with things like generators. Which party is going to put the generator battery on their tier 2 or the diesel fuel on their tier 2. Again, so that comes down to communication between the parties. You have to communicate with each other and decide who's going to put it on. It needs to go on somebody's form.
Right, exactly.
So that, in the case of tier 2, I feel like we're getting off track here, but in the case of tier 2, that's so that emergency responders know what's there, but it should be reported to the emergency responders by somebody.
Right. So a little bit off track, but honestly, the reporting and planning are really interlinked in this component of TUR planning in particular. So I think it's all good.
Yep. And I also know, from working with plant managers at lots of different plants that, especially for them conceptually, what's sitting in storage is part of their mental inventory. And so again, it comes down to communicating, and a lot of times in the old days it would be a site visit to help them mentally separate what's storage versus what's usage, because for them it can, especially at a small facility, and in my example this is a small facility, for them it's all part of their process. Like what's sitting in the drums is part of their mental process, and so it can take some communicating and really working through this process flow diagram to help pull apart which materials are being stored versus which ones are in active production.
Yeah, great questions.
Yeah. Any other questions, or does anybody have any other methods, best practices or tricks that they use to sort of double check what they're calculating before they get to the form entry part?
Yeah, to ensure mass balance or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, if you do, just pop it in the chat, or you can always raise your hand as well.
For sure.
Or you could just unmute yourself if you have a specific question or comment. So we have something here. Even if a company purchases bulk material and it is stored on site, it is only the use that counts for TRI and TUR
Yep.
reporting.
Yep, 100%.
Absolutely.
Yep.
I have a question. I want to do it verbally because I can't type very quickly. When you say otherwise used, so they're adjusting some element of the hydrochloric acid in the process unit. Why do you call that wastewater treatment? Why would you contribute? That's not neutralized as a wastewater treatment. That's an in-process control, part of the reaction.
You're talking about the 678 pounds?
No, that's truly post-treatment. That's wastewater treatment. But
Correct.
the otherwise used, that's not a wastewater treatment. So the question that you asked there was no answer to it. That's an otherwise used is like putting solvent paint.
No, it's so otherwise used, basically what they're using the HCl for here is to either clean or do something to the
Right.
product, and it's
They're-
passed through. So once it passes through, it then goes to wastewater treatment. The HCl is not incorporated into the product.
Right, no, and that's why I don't think the answer wasn't wastewater treatment. It's an in-process control. In other words, you need something to make the reaction go, I would guess. What is it actually doing? They're taking the water and putting it aside and treating it then, and then treating it downstream again on a final emission?
No, the HCl is going into the production process and is part of the silver coating process. So that's like I think they're using it to pre-treat the parts that they're plating,
Mhm.
but it doesn't become part of the product. So the
Right,
HCl
that's right.
passes through and then goes to their wastewater treatment, wastewater holding tank.
I think that's consumption. That's consumed in the process, not wastewater treatment.
It's neutralized
Well-
as wastewater.
So wastewater treatment is a different production unit.
Correct.
That's why I'm saying, that's why I think when you do your mass balance, you put that as in consumed in the process. Like neutralizing hydrochloric, I mean.
But
say
it's not consumed. It doesn't.
It does something because it changes the pH. The whole thing isn't still hydrochloric acid, is it? It's being consumed.
It
You're
is.
adding it
No,
for a
it
reason.
is still hydrochloric acid.
So one of the things that you're
reforms.
raising, John, that's interesting is the difference between production unit level balancing and facility level.
Good point,
balancing.
Pam. Yes.
And what you're doing here is a facility level mass balance and materials accounting.
Yep.
So the hydrochloric acid comes into the silver coating production unit, is part of that process, gets rinsed off of the parts, and that
Correct.
rinse water that contains the hydrochloric acid then moves into the wastewater pretreatment production unit, which is an entirely different production unit,
Correct.
in which,
Right.
and what you don't show there is the sodium hydroxide that's used
Correct.
to neutralize that
Right.
wastewater.
Yep.
So it is being neutralized, it is being chemically reacted, and consumed within that treatment, within that production unit. And then also, as we know, with any wastewater pretreatment facility and neutralization process, it's never perfect. So sometimes the sodium hydroxide will overshoot. So they need to also add some additional hydrochloric to adjust the pH to remain within the discharge permit levels.
Exactly.
Right. That's an important distinction, Pam, because I think that is probably causing a little bit of confusion because our mass balance is for the facility-wide process. But then in our process flow diagram, we're breaking that down by production unit.
Mhm.
And for simplicity, I didn't include so the sodium hydroxide, for instance, is not on here. I saw another little comment go by that somebody writes the chemical reactions on their process flow diagram to help clarify that, which I think is a great idea. And
Yeah,
I
that's cool.
probably should do that here
Yeah.
to help clarify that. Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Well,
it is.
to your point, once again, is that if you add hydrochloric acid and it's not consumed in the process, that means your output in the end should be the total amount, both wastewater and that, because you account for it differently and it goes in differently, but the total amount that leaves the plant has to be Because you said it's never, if it's not consumed, then it has to leave the plant. And that's not the case. I think when you do an acid strike, it preps the metal to go, you collect it, and then at the end of pipe, you have to add it all up and say, well, I guess maybe I don't know. It seems to me that this it's not wastewater treatment as you're suggesting. But anyways, I won't belabor the point.
It's all right. And John, also, remember too, that they were trying to simplify this to make a point. So.
Yeah, good point. Yep. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks for your question. All right, so here we're going to have a little exercise, critical thinking. So here's some numbers from 2019, 2018 hydrochloric acid usage. And, take a look at the numbers and kind of think about them. And, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but, what are some questions you might ask the folks at your plant, your clients? What would you question and kind of circle back around and say, this, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but I just want to make sure that we have it right and make sure everything adds up to make sure we have it correct year over year.
Right. So what we're doing is we're going to actually break you into breakout groups to have a conversation. So before I do that, I want to alert you to the fact that I've uploaded that slide that Dan was just showing into the chat. And so if each of you could go ahead and download that slide, you actually need to save it to your desktop or whatever. When I put you into the breakout discussion groups, it's helpful if one person in each group could share their screen and show that slide so that you're all looking at it. And then we just ask that you have a conversation together. So what do you see? What does it tell you? Does it make sense? How would you find out? Any questions about that before I put you into breakout rooms? Okay. I am going to do that now. And if you could all go ahead and download that, that mass balance. And then, yeah, also share your video and unmute yourself so that you can have a conversation with each other. I'll give you about 5 minutes. I'll give you a 1-minute warning. Okay, so off you go.
Station. For us, not knowing, coming in as a fresh set of eyes, maybe as a consultant for the company, because, there's certain things we don't know coming in. We'd want to know what the actual production was in order to make sense of the data. And we'd want to know what TUR activities took place between 2018 and 2019 because of the fact that the otherwise used was down, the treated on site was down, but the total use was up. We want to understand the differences between the fugitive and stack emissions. It looks like some TUR activity took place. So if we understand that, then we can say, yes, these numbers make sense. Or if there's nothing that's going on, then these numbers can't make sense.
Good. Thanks. Comments, Dan or Jill?
Pam, I got something. This is Julie Davies.
Go ahead, Julie. Thank you.
We struggled a little bit getting going, but once we did, we noticed that the amount generated as byproduct doesn't equal the usage. And that was strange to us because it doesn't seem like any of that hydrochloric acid would go into a product. So right off the bat, we seem to be missing something.
Can you
Because
point out?
otherwise-
Well, some of it was used to treat. That's why it was used in wastewater treatment. Like this is some similar data from what was up above in the slides above. So some of it was actually used to treat in wastewater.
Okay. Well, that was just something that we noticed.
Good.
Yeah, no, it's that was the point of the exercise is whether this is right or wrong, indifferent, but just to question the data and make sure that we got it right and that the plan's right, the data's right, the reporting lines up, and just all that kind of stuff for sure. Yeah.
Bill, you had a comment?
Yeah, actually, I have a couple. It looks like, to me anyway, that there is a column missing between air fugitive and air stack. And I think the numbers are way too low also for hydrochloric acid because these baths are usually heated in metal surface preparation. So the numbers just look way too small to me.
Cool.
In terms of fugitive. I mean,
Yeah.
even when you have good capture, surface level, I think the fugitives are going to be higher. But then also, there's the byproduct that goes to the stack before maybe it's scrubbed. So either
Yeah.
there's a scrubber here and that took care of it, or there wasn't a scrubber. So that's way too small in terms of stack emissions. And the big thing that stood out to me too was the production ratio, which we discussed. It's actually inverted. And I wouldn't call it a production ratio either. I would call it an activity ratio.
Nope, all good stuff. Thanks, Bill.
Why would you make that distinction?
Because it says in the regulations of both TRI and TUR that when it's an activity such as a cleaning, it's not a production ratio, it's an activity ratio. And I know there's been talk back and forth. It used to be called an activity index, but now it's called an activity ratio, I believe. But there's a definite distinction between the two. So case in point, if you have to use an acid to make a product, I guess that it could be looked at both ways, because if you have to use an acid to make a product, but you use a base to neutralize what's left over, that which is neutralized is an activity ratio. It's not a production ratio. So I think a lot of times when you look at these things, if you say production ratio, at least to me, it doesn't really make sense because it wasn't really part of the product. It was something used to clean a surface so you could make a product. So that's an activity.
Yep.
Okay.
But
Oh,
there's
good
no
points.
real product. There's no real product here. So we can't say that pounds of use per pounds of toxic per product. There's just a little bit missing there.
Okay.
Sure.
Again, thanks to Dan and Jill for providing this simplified version. But yeah, let's move on. Thanks, Dan.
Yep, of course.
Hey, Pam.
So just, yes,
Can I
if I
say
could
something
ask-
before we start, though?
Yeah, can you go back,
Um,
Dan?
of course.
Thank you. I
ahead,
just
Lynn.
want to emphasize, yeah, thank you. I just want to say that we've just sent out our annual QA QC, exception reports. And I want to emphasize how, it's this is a good example of the byproduct not equaling everything that's on the Form R. So
Mhm.
I just wanted to point that out.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Thanks.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, and I would just like to say that all of these questions about production and, fugitive emissions and did they introduce a scrubber and what's exactly happening? I think these are exactly the point of this exercise. Like again, this wasn't intended as a math exercise,
No.
more of just something seems off. And so what questions do we need to ask to understand what's happening and to get at a better picture of what's really happening in the production?
Yep.
Right. It's that critical thinking aspect of the
Sure.
overall planning process that is so important and a really good reminder. So sitting down and looking at last cycle's reports or last year's reports versus this year's and saying, does this make sense? And how can I be sure? That's the point.
Yep,
Thank you.
exactly. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Just to wrap up materials accounting, don't reinvent the wheel. So last few years planning cycles, what we've really tried to do is, get all the numbers crunched in mass balance and all that kind of stuff for the forms, R's, Form S's. And then what we try to do is don't reinvent the wheel. We incorporate that information right into the plan. And instead of, we used to try to insert some of the data into the plan and the different sections. And now we just point to the appendix and make sure, or an attachment to make sure that, the data is in one place and we point to it just to reduce error, reduce duplication, reduce work, and trying to update numbers here and there because they're in multiple places and that kind of thing. So just, Use the data that you have from reporting, put it into the plan, and we try not to duplicate it just so we can reduce the chance of error from transcribing it from one location to the next location and just things like that. So just something we've decided and learned to do just to make it easier and basically just to improve the data quality as well. So now we'll talk a little bit about unit of product. So basically unit of product, you want to get, a measurement that is as close to possible relative to the production and how that chemical is used. In this example that same example we've kind of been using as we went along, this is square feet of pieces. And you can see that each of the production units, that square feet of pieces has gone through all those production units. But you could have a scenario where, I don't know, maybe production unit 3 doesn't see all the pieces go through, or it sees more pieces go through or something of that nature. So the number could be higher or lower. But we have a polling question, and Pam, if you'd be kind enough to do so. So is it possible to have more than one unit of products at your facility?
Great, we got a lot of people answering right away. Give it a
Mhm.
couple more seconds and I'll end the poll. Get your response in there, yes or no? Okay, I'm going to end the polling now and share our results. And Dan, what do you think?
So yes, you can. So, I mean, you could have a facility that processes 2 different types of products, materials, and you could have, I don't know, you could be processing, say, wire in one end and maybe something else on the other end that's maybe a flat substance or something of that nature. And maybe the wire you track in linear feet or miles or whatever, and maybe the flatter piece that you're putting through production in a different production unit, maybe you use surface area or something of that nature, square footage or square centimeters or something like that. So you most certainly can. It's specific to each individual production unit is what you want to get it down to.
Okay.
So which unit of product do you want to use for your facility? And, this is not mandated by DEP. They don't dictate, depending on what process you use, that you have to use a specific unit of product. It's up to the facility to basically try to get at what is the best representation of what I'm processing and how am I measuring that relative to how I'm using the chemical. So, if you're mixing something into a paint, I mean, maybe you want to use pounds or gallons or something like that. If you're, again, processing a wire or something, maybe it's linear feet or miles or something like that. But in this example, we have a production of normalized, we have a production unit of square feet, and basically it's normalized to the chemical. And what you want to do that for is, based on how much chemical you use, you want to figure out how much of that chemical is used per your unit of product, per your square footage, per your gallon, per your pound, whatever the case may be. So that year over year, you can then look at that information and say, all right, well, it looks like production went up in 2019, but we used less silver compounds manufactured to get to the same 1,000 square feet. So, it looks like even though production went up, we use less material. So we're doing toxic use reduction. And with the same production ratio, we did it against the hours of operation. The facility operated the same hours of operation, production went up, but you can see here, maybe not the best representation because it looks like usage went up relative to the hours, but we know that based on a better unit of product for this process, it actually went down. So, it's important to take a look at what you're doing. And again, think strategically relative to what am I processing? How am I processing it? And how is the chemical being applied or used or whatever the case may be? And how can I best represent that so that when I do look at it year over year relative to the normalized data, that, we can see the actual trend of whether it's going up or down relative to what we're producing. And then, you can have, again, like I said, it's not dictated by DEP. They don't tell you what unit of product to use. So you can use whatever makes sense for your facility. Revenue, number of widgets. I mean, sometimes, if you haven't, maybe you're cleaning with the solvent, but you have hundreds and hundreds of parts that go through that solvent with intricate designs and whatnot. So to calculate the surface area, which may be the best unit of product, is near impossible. So maybe you use number of parts degreased or something of that nature. But you have to take a look at it and figure out what it is you think would be the best to represent what it is you're doing relative to the toxic that you're using. So Pam, again, we have another polling question just to generate some conversation. So which production units do you folks use in your operations, or that you've seen, or something of that nature?
And just to note that you can choose more than one if you have more than one.
Sure, that'd be great. This is good. It looks like it's spread out all over the place. Nice.
Give it a couple more seconds and then
Sure.
I'll end the polling.
Sure.
Okay. So there you go. There are the results. You
Yeah.
want to comment?
Yeah, it looks all over the place relative to what people process, for sure. So does anybody have an example of, maybe you started new at a company and you changed the unit of products with DEP to reflect a better unit of products, or any kind of examples that anybody may have? Feel free to raise your hand and share your experiences. More than welcome to share them, please.
We have a comment here from Bill that he wouldn't use dollars or revenue because of market fluctuations.
Sure, yeah.
And yet it may still be the right choice for
Sure.
a
That
specific
facility. Yep.
facility.
Again, you're not mandated to pick one way or the other. It's up to your business operations and what you folks think at your company, what might be the right unit of measure. So,
Go ahead, Bill.
The reason that I wouldn't use dollars is because, first of all, especially with plating companies, because of market fluctuation, and a lot of them are job shops. So what they're getting for something this year from this group of customers versus another group of customers could be totally different. And it really skews your end result, because the end result is really going to be how much of that's used per square inch or centimeter or square foot of material.
sure.
And by using dollars, it always, to me, always looks screwy. So that's one thing that I did have changed in a plating company when I came in, just because dollars are all over the place.
Yeah.
Plus, when you really think about it, do you want everybody to know what your revenue is?
Sure. No, hey, it's a good point. I'm glad you shared it. Thanks, Bill.
So I'm
Sure.
curious, we have a couple people who actually do use that as their unit of product. And as I say, depending on what your facility and your process is, it may be the most representative thing. I'm curious if anybody who uses that could comment on it.
Hey Pam, this is Jim Curran.
Go ahead.
And I was one of the ones that put in revenue. I had a customer who I picked up as a TUR planner after they're already into the process. So they had revenue as their unit of measure before I got there. And I questioned about changing it, but then they have a wide variety of different products. And what happened is really trying to sort out the differences in those products, because some of the sizes are very different and things like that. So it was very hard to normalize that to something that made sense across all the products they sold. So even though I was pretty reluctant to use revenue as a measure, after being there for a while, I recognized that was probably the best we could do based upon the wide variety of their products.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. That's important.
Yeah, I
Jeff
appreciate it.
also noted that it's also depends on what kinds of unit of product is available.
Sure.
And it's
Agreed.
hard sometimes to get more specific. So that
Yeah.
may be just the best you can get. So
Yep.
good conversation. I
Right,
will
it just
stop
that
sharing.
it's not always, I mean, you want it to be the best correlator.
Yeah.
That's your
Mhm.
objective. But sometimes you're not going to achieve that objective. So there's a compromise there.
Sure.
And you end up with something that isn't as good of a correlator to pick for a unit of product. So you might have to, in some cases, use something else that isn't it's nice to say square feet, but if you're processing over 5,700 parts a year and they're all
Right.
different square
Right.
footage, and now you're going to start trying to figure out how many each one
Right.
of those that you process, you're going to quickly realize that area is certainly not one that you want to go down the path.
Yeah, 100%.
Good,
Yeah.
great
Good
discussion.
feedback.
And to add that on, especially if you're gonna do area and they have a wide variety of products and areas all different on all of them, then that makes it even more difficult.
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
So Lucy, you had a comment and then we should move on.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Bill, when you switched from revenue in a job shop, what did you switch to for unit of product?
Area,
Great.
because once you implement a system, and I know for a lot of companies, for smaller plating companies, they don't want to get in a computer and do work. But when customers are submitting a bid to them for a particular project, they can also ask the customer how many of which type widget, and you have them give you the data right off the bat in a spreadsheet. Then you have it.
Yeah.
What's the length, width, height, and how many of these are we going to do? And then you automatically have your area. That's what makes that easier, but you have to push back on the customer.
Right,
Mhm.
and each example is unique, and
Yes.
so that's the point here, is to really think this through. So let's
Yeah.
move on.
Yep. All right, cool. Thanks, everybody. Integral recycling. So integral recycling. So the material must be recycled, reused, and it can't be treated. It's got to be permanently or via detachable connection to a single production unit. And directly connected, if you're going to use a holding tank to do this, directly connected to a holding tank in a single production unit as well, same thing. So I have 3 examples to go through. So in this example, I'm just using simple TCE. So they use 18,500 pounds of TCE. It's integrally recycled to the degreaser itself. So connected to, stilled right there. Sometimes they have to do cleanouts and whatnot. So what is my byproduct in this situation? Well, it's what gets shipped off and what goes up to air. So in this case, it's just a pass through. The recycling is not taken into consideration, so that it doesn't add to your byproduct and it doesn't add to your usage because it's integrally recycled. If it's not integrally recycled, it's a same situation, TCE, but you don't have a still directly attached to or connected to the degreaser, and you have a still someplace else in the facility. In this particular case, you wouldn't add it to the usage, so the usage would still be the 18.5, but you would add it to your byproducts, and that's where in the forms there's the option to balance it off by saying you've recycled X amount or whatever the case may be. And the third example that I have is basically if you don't recycle it on site, but you have an arrangement with somebody that you send it off to have it recycled, and they give it back to you so you can blend it into the new TCE and add to it so it's cheaper or whatever. In this particular case, you do add it to the byproducts just like the last one, but you also have to add it to the usage because it was recycled off-site and not on-site. So that turns the 18.5 into 22.5. So your actual usage also would go up when you're putting up against thresholds and whatnot. And that's we have a polling question or questions, I believe. So does your facility or a client do integral recycling, or does your facility do any other type of recycling that's not integral? And then if people would like to advertise some unique scenarios or something of that nature, I think that would be wonderful. So once we get the results, if anybody's willing to talk about maybe something that was, integral recycled, maybe other than TCE or something of that nature. And then maybe if we have some examples of maybe some recycling of toxics that you do that is not integral that you might want to talk about, that would be great.
Okay, I'm going to give it a couple of more seconds. We
Sure.
got some people still thinking on it, putting in their results.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Go ahead.
Yep. So for those that do integral recycling, is there any examples you have on maybe TCE included, but other than TCE, maybe even, or on the flip side down? So the second question, that some recycling that you may do on site or off site or whatever that you put back into your process, maybe you can give us some examples of that. That would be great if you're willing to share those.
So does anybody have an example they'd like to just offer?
Can I jump in? I'm not sure how to raise my hand.
Yeah,
well,
go for
that's
it.
okay. Jump
So
in.
We often have drums. We're accessing our toxics from drums. There might be a 55-gallon drum, and when you get to the end of the drum, there's a little bit left at the bottom. So we'll do like a triple rinse before we send a drum back, but there might be a couple pounds left at the bottom of the drum. And then a lot of our processes use, let's say it's hydrochloric acid at a certain concentration. We're already adding water, so we just use that as water in our formula, and it goes right back into our product.
Great example. I've heard of that at other facilities as well. So great example, Chris. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody else have anything they can share?
I have a client that recycles metal, but they do it off-site, and they don't bring it back to the facility. So it's really, it doesn't ever end up in their use. It only is a material that's sent off-site for recycling.
Gotcha.
So it's interesting too that it's a 50-50 split on whether or not facilities actually do recycling of other materials.
At our facility, we have to use a chemical to clean our tanks before we, during a PM, and we have to do it twice, so it's a double rinse. So the second flush that we call it a flush, we save that to do the first flush on the next cleaning.
Cool.
So we're reusing.
Nice. That's great.
Really great. Dave has an example of using scrubber solutions that are sent back into the process to make the product. So lots of great examples. That's wonderful.
That's great.
All right, I'll stop sharing.
Yep, good. All right. Oops. And that wraps up our materials accounting presentation. And again, just to reiterate what we tried to go through, but data quality and validation is just to basically ensure that your data is accurate and representative. And again, that critical thinking to make sure that, does this make sense? And do I have everything in the right place? And then consistency between reporting and planning. Why reinvent the wheel or try to duplicate data or duplicate, calculations or whatever. If you've done them for reporting, slip them into the planning just to make it easier. Choose the best unit of product that will show your improvements. Get as, like, I think it was Jeff that said it, get as close as you can, but sometimes you got to make compromises and use something that's more reasonable and that kind of thing. So do what you can to get as close as you can to show those improvements. But, again, it's not mandated by anybody that you choose one thing over another. And then if you are doing integral recycling or recycling on site, make sure you're, accounting for what you're doing and taking credit for it where you can. So. And if anybody has any further questions or things they'd like to share, by all means, ask. And then that's all we had.
Thanks so much, Dan and Jill, both.
Pleasure.
Really great
Thank you, Pam.
refresher on the things that we need to think about when we're doing our materials accounting. So for the last 12 minutes, I wanted to invite Veronica O'Donnell and Lynn Kane to answer any questions that folks may have for DEP. Veronica, if you want to just start off, if you had any comments that you wanted to make.
I thought it was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Veronica.
So does anybody have any questions for DEP? I know that one of the things I just wanted to comment on is that one of the reasons that we do our fundamentals at each of the conferences is because we know from some of the DEP review of TUR planning is that some of the fundamental aspects of planning slip in plans. And so it's important for you as planners to just be reminded and refreshed around what it is you need to do. And then a presentation like this where you're getting best practices is just really great. But we know that there were some discrepancies between reporting and planning in recent plans. So that's why this is a really important topic to cover. But I just, again, I want to open it up is if there's anybody who has a question for Veronica or Lynn, please go ahead.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Julie.
It's kind of a reporting thing. On the forms, there's a spot to put one-time release or catastrophic event. Now, I had a discussion with one of my clients last time around, and they said that they normally ship, let's say, to Clean Harbors. They usually ship all their waste to Clean Harbors. This one particular reporting year, they shipped one drum to Heritage, for lack of a better example. And they wanted me to consider that a one-time event. And I thought that that's not really what that spot was for. Could you comment on what that?
So Lynn, do you have a comment?
Extra, we sent it somewhere else?
Yeah, I'll comment. I also I'm sorry, Julie, I just want to say that I want to say what a great job I think Dan and Jill did too. I think it was really good. Anyway, okay, so about your question, it sounds like it is a one-time event. Why?
Okay.
So why are you concerned about that?
It just seemed like it was just normal waste shipment, and you sent it somewhere else. Why did it matter? In my mind, that catastrophic or one-time event was more of a release or some type of an emergency or spill or something like that. I never considered using it for that purpose. So I just wanted your thoughts.
I think of it as a catastrophic event or a one-time event, either one.
Interesting. I probably would have gone the same way you suggested, Julie. If it's something that they're doing, but they're just sending it to a different facility, is that different?
Yeah, because my concern is what if they do it next year, it's not a one-time event anymore.
Right, because there is a spot in the form.
I agree with you, but if it is,
designate
I would
different
consider,
locations.
again, if it's, yeah. I'm having a bad connection, but anyway, I do think it depends on how often it is. If it's just once, it's considered a one-time event. If it happens every year, it's not. So
got it.
Right. So I guess it doesn't really matter. You can do it either way.
So Ed, I see your hand is up, and also Kurt, I noticed that you unmuted yourself. Does that mean you have a question?
No, I just wanted to participate if something did come up. I wanted
Excellent,
to be.
thanks. So let's let Ed ask his question.
Yep. Is there going to be any delay in the reporting deadline like last year? Is DEP considering that, or is it still July 1st?
this year it's July 1st.
Thank you.
I was kind of hoping the same with IRS, but Any other comments or questions for DEP, or any other comments or questions in general? Liz, I think you wanted to respond to a question from Tuesday's session.
Right. Ed had asked on Tuesday through the chat whether the PFAS, if it came in your processed water from the municipal water supply or your groundwater, whether that was something you had to factor into reporting. And I think we gave you a qualified answer, but looked it up, and yes, the TRI exemption is there for any listed toxic chemical present in water that you draw into your facility from the environment or municipal sources.
Yeah, one thing that I found, I kind of looked into this more with EPA, and they said potentially you would have to report it if it's because of your contamination. So if it's off-site and like from an airport and you're an industrial park next to an airport and it's from,
firefighting foam, then you don't have to report it. But if it's something that your process put into the ground and then you sucked it back up, theoretically that is from your facility. So that's another qualification.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Good point. Good
Yeah.
point for any listed chemical then, if you're finding that in your intake from your groundwater.
Great. Any other questions? Any other comments from DEP? Any other comments from Dan and Jill?
I want to mention that our forms, our EDP forms should be live at some point this month. We don't have an exact date, but at some point this month, Walter anticipates that they'll be live.
Okay, thanks. And Mike Pearnock, I am not missing you today. Go.
Hey, thank you.
I blew him off on Tuesday.
No
so.
problem. Just a quick question about this whole PFAS, PFOA issue. If you have a private well that you're using that water in your production process, as a result, do you need to sample that water for the potential for PFAS and PFOA? I know no one wants to because you're likely going to find it, but
no one's
it's a whole other
required.
bag of worms from a drinking water standpoint, an MCP standpoint, but
Yeah, no one's required, as far as I know, no one's required to yet, but a lot of people are doing it for, identifying future potential issues and liabilities. Let's put it that way.
Background. Yeah.
I mean, maybe you can help me. I don't have them in front of me, but the amount of pounds that you would have to generate. I mean, we're dealing with part per trillion detection limits for an expensive lab analysis to assess that. So any sense of how, once again, I apologize, I don't have it in front of me, how many pounds you would have to then generate to have it be reportable?
It's 100 pounds per compound. Isn't that what they're proposing for Form R?
Yeah.
And at a part per trillion, that scratches my head.
I'm sure that's hundreds of thousands of gallons.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, and you also have the de minimis unless it's a PBT.
All right,
So it
thank
is
you.
not a simple issue.
Never is.
No.
So, Liz, what you just said, so if we're talking PPT levels, they'll never come to that de minimis percentage, I hope.
Correct, and I believe that they haven't designated the PFAS that they've listed under TRI as PBTs yet. Is that right, Lynn?
I thought they were designated as PBTs.
They have a reporting threshold, but that's because they were put in by the National Defense Authorization Act rather than through their normal process. So I guess we can check that out.
We will look into that, and I'm going to be creating the changes document, reporting changes document that we do every year and put on our website. So I will include that information in that. And for the reporting of the new TRI PFAS chemicals.
Well,
Lynn, do you have an estimated date when that's going to come out? Sorry, Mike.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm working on it this month. I would say by the end of this month. Yeah.
Well, one other thing just to add to it, because from the other end of the house where we're using ISO to do in situ inoculations, we're doing treatability studies, because one of the problems with the PFAS and PFOA is if I'm using the ISO, it biotransforms and generates products that were no longer there, which is a problem at the other end of the spectrum. So that also makes me wonder if you do have it and there is a process that it's going through, whether it biotransform and make more of the expanded list that presently isn't regulated, or the smaller list that is regulated compounds you normally wouldn't see unless it underwent some kind of chemical reaction. So I just throw that out there as food for thought.
Yeah, that is a real concern. And this is Tiffany Skogstrom from OTA, and I'm just going to say that we're attempting to help companies identify and reduce their use of PFAS if possible. So please think of us if you're looking for free and confidential assistance. We're helping people try to identify that, so that, all of these other questions that you build up, we can eliminate at least one source and help with that. And I do believe that the 100 pounds, even though it's 100 pounds, it's not a PBT according to EPA yet.
Thank you.
Good discussion. Any